Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May God's blessings and peace be upon you. Good Studios, where every weekday at 6 p.m. we have something special to talk about. On Mondays, we have Clearing the Mist with Ken Hamilton. On Tuesdays, we have the Rick and Rhonda Show. On Thursdays, we have Keeping It Frank with Frank Handley. And on Friday, he will be with me on Faith Matters, discussing different topics regarding faith or no faith at all. America just witnessed June 19th, which commemorates the emancipation of the enslaved slaves who came from Africa many centuries ago. Now that it has become a federal holiday, the hope is that more people will realize the significance of what we have achieved. But there's still ways to go. Last week we talked about Juneteenth and briefly its history, and we touched on the concept of slavery and what Christianity talks about it. We heard Pastor Kaiser Pointer talking about it from African American and Christian perspective, and we had Mr. Amer Aziz, who is the Vice President of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, barely touching the surface of what Islam has to say about the issue of slavery. So today we decided to talk a little bit more in depth of the Islamic teachings and perspectives on this issue of slavery. So on my left, I have Amer Aziz again, who is the Vice President of Ahmadiyya Muslim Community. Welcome, Amer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss this very important and crucial topic.
Absolutely. So let's go into a little bit of his background. How did it come to be that a human decided to just enslave another human and become its master and just forfeiting all the rights of another human being? How did it happen?
I think most historians would point to that the historical backdrop or the origination instance for slavery most likely has to do with war and in the outcome of war. And in typical situations, where one side defeats another side and overcomes it and overtakes it, there's a significant population for the people who have been conquered that is absorbed into the conqueror's realm, whether it's territorial or it's social. And initially, one can look at it as there's probably a sense of supremacy on part of those who have, who are the conquerors, and there is a sense of maybe reprisals, that this is what these people or this class or this particular community or country deserves, for having fought against us or for having attacked us perhaps, or having resisted us in some way. So you're absorbing in a population, and most likely you put them into a place where they're very highly subservient, and they wouldn't have too many rights, they wouldn't have too much freedom at that point. And I think gradually that turns into somewhat of a socio-economic outcome, where there is a large pool of a labor class which is economically, I would say, very cost-effective as slaves. Then as that gradually progresses and rolls over, and maybe rolls over through generations, you have a sort of a slave labor or a slave class that exists. Now, in historical narratives, I think the earliest that we can point to is actually the story of the Hebrews under the Egyptians. So at some point in history, the Egyptians would have conquered the Hebrews in that particular area in in Egypt. And as the biblical story goes, the Hebrews are a very downtrodden, a very enslaved labor class under Pharaoh, and God sees this as a very unfavorable situation, has a favorable view of the Hebrews, and sends Moses as his messenger with the decree to free his people and to bring them out of Egypt. So I think that's what we think is the most likely backdrop. And I think gradually what happens, especially when Islam comes into it, and now we're talking about 6th, 7th century AD, there is a lot of, I think at that point it's a cultural norm. Slavery is likely a cultural norm, and it's pre-existed from that era through the Babylonian empires and the Persian empires and the Roman and the Greeks and all the civilizations that took place, I think, from kind of that origination point, if you can call that as the origination point with Pharaoh and the Hebrews, up to the point where it's a normalized, culturalized aspect of society in Arabia. So we think that is most likely the background. And I think an important thing to point out is that there's most likely, and especially when we look at the verses of the Quran and how it's addressing and the things that it's saying, that there is a dehumanization aspect that happens with that, especially when a slave labor class has existed over several generations, maybe several centuries, and maybe even 1,000 years, a millennia or so. It becomes normalized, it becomes culturalized, and they do become dehumanized. And we've sort of seen that in the modern day as well. The American aspect of Juneteenth and the backdrop and the reason that we're talking about this today and why we have this holiday is because that exact scenario played out in the American origination story, where a large enslaved labor class was shipped from Africa, brought here, and then they were situated in these plantations, the tobacco and the tea plantations, which was the bigger industries back in the, I think the early 19th century. And there is a dehumanization aspect to it, that this is a property, this is somebody who has no freedom, doesn't have a right to freedom, and is fortunate or lucky to be placed where they are, placed where they have some subsistence for what they're doing.
I think this dehumanization and becoming a social norm is also a product of desensitization. So when you don't even recognize them as remotely equal to you as a human, and then you forfeit their rights, and you are just a commodity that can be dealt with in any which way that the owners would feel like.
Right, and they were traded as commodities.
Right.
They were actually traders or commercial enterprises which went out to seek these slave labor, and sometimes I think they would go into certain parts of a certain geography where they may be poor and they may be weak and then not able to defend themselves, and then kind of harvest them and bring them to these supposedly more civilized centers, maybe the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire, and sell them there for a good profit. So yeah, definitely commoditization is a...
So as you mentioned that slavery is mentioned in ancient text, Bible included, and so this has been going on for thousands of years. And when Islam came into being, slavery existed at the time of Prophet Muhammad also. So what is Islam's position on slavery?
So from an Islamic perspective, and specifically the scripture, the source, the greatest source that we have in Islam, in the religion, which is the Quran itself, the verse that we primarily point to is in chapter 90, and it's spread out through verses 9 to 17, but it's talking about what are great acts of righteousness. Right? And the primary pointer, and the first thing that is actually pointed out there as a great act of righteousness, especially if you want to gain a great favor with God, and it's mentioned as the high road. The text specifically says that what would make you know what the high path is, or what the great path is, or the highest path is, and then it says it's the freeing of a slave. It's giving somebody their dignity, their humanity, and their freedom, and it's that particular act that will gain you great favor with God. And then it's also subsequently mentioned as manumission of sins. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're looking to make right with God because of something that you may have done, or something that burdens your conscience greatly, then again it says that as manumission for that particular sin, if you free a slave, that is going to provide you with that conscious relief and that moral disposition. So these verses, which kind of make the core, the fundamental disposition of slavery, is telling you that it's a great act of morality to give somebody their freedom.
I mean, it is a position which causes significant socio-psycho-economic impact on the person who has been enslaved and has been deprived of all the rights as a human. So how does Islam deals with the various aspects associated with getting enslaved and dehumanize and render the position which is extremely inferior to that of the master or his family?
Right. So especially with the dehumanization aspect, I'll point, like I just mentioned one verse, but it actually, the Quran also addresses slaves directly. So it's not just addressing you to commit a great act of righteousness by freeing a slave, but it's also addressing slaves and asking you to treat them with human dignity and with kindness. So, for example, one of the verses that actually outlines this is that it says that, and do good to your parents. So parents have a great status in all religion, in all societies, including Islam. So do good to your parents and your relations, your kin, the orphans, the needy, and then the slaves, or what your right hands possess. This is a term that's applied in the Quran frequently for slavery. And then Allah does not love those who are proud. So by equating slaves with parents and your kin, it is automatically elevating their status. And then I think this process...
Mentioned in the same sentence.
It's in the mention in the same sentence. And this happens repeatedly. And then it also, in other verses, for example, here's another one, which is in chapter 2, verse 222, and says, do not marry idol-worshipping women, okay, idolatrous women, until they believe, until they give up idolatry. And it says that a believing slave woman is actually better than a non-believing free woman. So, and in other verses, it tells you for Muslims to, when you're seeking somebody in marriage, according to your status, according to your means, some people will be able to find a believing woman, let's say from a prominent background, and others may not be in the same position to do that. And it actually tells them to go and marry a slave woman, who is a believer. So asking Muslims to take them as wives is again a very significant step, a very significant, almost like a bombshell, that you should do that and that you can do that. And then again, it creates that amazing humanization aspect and starts to cause that psychological shift as how you view a person.
And not only just marry, but give the woman all the rights.
Including inheritance.
Including inheritance.
Which is a very big deal, and was a very big deal at that time.
Right.
Including the emancipation of women.
Right. So can you tell us the emphasis that Islam laid on, on, on not only just freeing the slaves, but how what teachings it came with in order in when it came to just dealing with them and associated with them in the society that they were in.
Right.
Dressing them, giving them jobs, and what could they do to? What did they have the rights to free themselves uh, if they wanted to, or once they were enslaved, then they were enslaved for life.
Right. So it's good. Like the verses that I just mentioned, it's good to have a fundamental principle that is stipulated as far as committing a high moral act um, uh, for freeing a slave, or equating slaves with your parents and how you're kind to your parents and your kin. But you also would like to have something that is more process oriented, a bit more structural, a bit more compelling. So we actually have that, and we have a concept that is known as mukatabat. And this I'm actually sourcing from a book which you can find on alislam.org. It's called Islam and Slavery. It's by Mirza Bashir Ahmed. May Allah be pleased with him. He's one of the sons of the promised Messiah, who we Ahmadis believe was the second coming of Jesus. And this actually sources a verse in the Quran which says that if a slave can arrange a means of compensation for the owner, that would satisfy the owner of the slave. And that arrangement can be done, then it is compelling and obligatory upon you to engage into that contract and to free that particular slave. So this actually, that creates a practical framework for this to happen, and for it to happen in a gradual manner. And in fact, in the early examples that we have in Islam, we particularly have the example of Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq, who was one of the companions, and he was actually the very first caliph and successor of the Prophet Muhammad, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, who was also a very wealthy, a very affluent trader. So he would actually engage into these contracts with slave owners, and sometimes these slave owners were not Muslims, and free slaves, and especially slaves who were inclined towards the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad and towards Islam. And one of the prime examples that we have is of Hazrat Bilal, who was most likely of African descent, and he was a slave, and he was inclined towards Islam, and he wanted to join the community, and he actually bought his freedom. So there were several examples of that, and somebody of Abu Bakr's status, and we know, and I'm sure some non-Muslims know as well, of his status in Islam, and even back then being one of the first converts of Islam, being one of the close companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his closest aide, and then becoming the first caliph after his passing away, his acts also had great significance. And then the Prophet Muhammad himself married a slave girl by the name of Maria, which is a very famous incident. And somebody of his status, who's not just a spiritual leader, he's also a sort of a temporal leader. He's a chief arbiter of Medina, where he's overseeing a common legal framework for Muslims, for Jewish tribes, and possibly some small heterodox Christian tribes as well. And then he's also military commander. He engages in military in martial activity with the Quraysh who attacked him, and eventually overcomes them. So there's empire forging at the time as well. So somebody of his status marrying a slave girl cannot create a better example, and that's going to be followed and replicated repeatedly, and then it's going to create this gradual impact.
Just to make sure that the taboo is broken, that a nobleman, a prophet of God, if he can marry a slave girl, then why can't others?
Right. And also, if I may mention one more instance, which is very significant, is that not just freeing the slaves or acts of marriage as such, but the social mobility that was seen during that time. So particularly the example of a former slave by the name of Salman the Persian, or Salman Farsi. Muslims know him very well. He's a very famous name. He was a former slave, and he apparently he was freed, and he was part of the Islamic movement, and eventually went on to become the governor of Madian in modern-day Iraq by some accounts. And then there is Salman the Persian and Shuaib the Roman. Shuaib Rumi is also another very famous name who became a very prominent leader as well.
So there was emphasis to not only provide shelter, but to provide for clothing and food of similar kind as the master. But Islam did not just, why didn't it just say that, okay, just every Muslim, just free all the slaves at once? Why didn't it did not abolish slavery just outrightly? So what was the wisdom, if any, behind that act that Prophet Muhammad and God in Quran did not just say, okay, just free all slaves and be done with it?
Right, so like when we were discussing the historical backdrop, we're looking at a situation, a scenario which has played out over centuries likely, right? The Hebrew story of the bondage of the Hebrews under Pharaoh is, I believe, 2,000 years prior to Islam.
Prior to Islam, yeah.
Prior to Islam, roughly about 2,000 years
Yeah.
or so. So we can just imagine that, you know, the culturalization aspect, the normalization aspect, dehumanization and all that is something that's played out over many, many centuries. So there's definitely a socioeconomic dependency up on this slave labor class, right? I mean, you have people who are engaged in commerce, in trade, they're going on expeditions, they're dependent on these slaves. On these expeditions, they're probably dependent on slaves for the management of their household while they're away. Whatever farming is taking place, whatever kind of manufacturing is taking place, is heavily dependent on this kind of labor. So an outright prohibition would likely cause a very significant disruption event. And that kind of disruption can lead into multiple social problems and ills. And also understand that Prophet Muhammad is at this point sort of the de facto leader of Medina, and he has a responsibility in leadership in the socio-economic welfare of that area. So you have this dependency, and then the disruption can likely lead to criminal activity, because if there's a large pool of people who have suddenly lost their framework of how they were being taken care of, and and who was providing for them and for their provisions.
Now on the streets without any income or place to live.
Exactly. I mean, there's no holding cells at the time, there's no apartment complexes and those kinds of things. So when you're out in the street and you are dislocated and disoriented, we've seen that a lot of criminal activity usually takes place in these kind of situations. There can be a lot of prostitution as a result of that. There can be other kinds of social problems. So it appears that the way Islam did this with a significant amount of wisdom was probably the most appropriate way and the most wise way of doing it, which was a gradual process where, like we said, we have examples of people who are free, and then there's social mobility, and there's merit-based outcomes and promotions or statuses of people. So slavery actually continued to exist even in, at least historically it's reported, even in Islamic eras like the Abbasid era and the Umayyad era. And it gradually is removed, and it's not until the Islamic medieval period that we see that it's more or less gone. And what's interesting is that when the Islamic Empire is kind of at its peak, and this would be, I think, after the Abbasid era, kind of more towards the Ottoman era, we don't have examples of people being shipped over from weaker parts of the world where they can be used as slave labor classes and brought to, let's say, Constantinople or Istanbul later as it was known, and used as a labor class. Unfortunately, as we have in the American historical story where that did happen, in the Islamic background, and especially with the Ottoman Empire, we don't have an example of that kind of activity.
So basically, the enslavement was highly discouraged, and the freeing of the slaves on a good footing was encouraged. So thank you, Amer. I think we are almost towards the end of the program. Very interesting discussion, and thanks for enlightening us what Islamic teachings and perspectives are about slavery. Just to remind you that tomorrow, June 25th, 2022, here at where the Naz Studio is located at 6951 Williams Road, Niagara Falls. We are having a community day for the whole family. There will be food, there will be petting zoo, pony rides, music. There will be different vendors. So it will be a fun day for the whole family. I encourage all of you to come and enjoy the day. So we're almost out of time. Just to remind you that we are live from Naz 716 Studios, where every weekday at 6 o'clock we have something interesting to talk about. Mondays we have Clearing the Mist with Ken Hamilton. Tuesday, the Rick and Rhonda Show. Wednesday, Vibing with Vicky Weidman. Thursday, Keeping It Frank with Frank Handley. And on Fridays, you will be with me, Faith Matters. Bidding you goodbye. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey guys, just wanted to remind you before the end of this show. Just wanted to remind you the things going on at Naz 716 Business and Culture Center. It's located at 6951 Williams Road at the corner of Lancelot and Williams Road in town of Wheatfield, not too far from Niagara Falls, obviously, close to Niagara Falls Airport. This building that you see right behind me, I'll see if I can switch the camera. Hang on a second. Let me figure it out. There you go. So we're going to have so many activities right outside, right here, where I'm standing. In the parking lot, we're going to barricade half of the parking. We're going to have a few giveaways, petting zoo, pony ride, music, food, vendors, face painting, balloon artist. We're going to have a bounce house, which is sponsored by Doug Moradian. He's running for State Assembly, 145th District. Anyways, besides that, we're going to have like culture, clothing, jewelry, prizes, basketball raffle, and network with the Naz 716 Studio. Everyone that you see on TV with our Naz Studio are going to be here, so you can mingle with them, you can talk to them. You can be on TV too, you can be live, be part of this whole thing as well. So it's going to be right here. So this event is going to start at 2 p.m. It's going to go up to 6 p.m. So from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. it will be right here in this parking lot tomorrow, Saturday. But before this event, before 2 p.m. event, we have free youth workshops. There are 2 workshops from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. There are limited spots, so you want to be the first come, first serve basis. You can call and you can reserve your spot as well. But the 2 workshops are, one is going to be introduction to podcasting. So you can hold a podcasting just like this, just like the studio podcasting that you've been watching. You can be part of that as well. I'll be hosting that. And then for the second workshop at the same time will be on health, hygiene, and makeup. A lot of people are interested in both of these things. We are getting really excited about this. We're working day and night. A lot of vendors have called us. We are expecting that you'll come with your family. Oh, by the way, everything that I announced is going to be free of charge. You don't have to pay anything out of your pocket. It's all inclusive, zero price. Fun day for kids to be here. Sorry, somebody called me. I hope you could hear me. It's going to be a fun day for all the kids to come and be part of this. A lot of activities. For a few hours, you're going to be able to have so much fun, but not too far from your home. I'm walking around to show you where I'm located. Again, that's William Road right there, and that's Lancelot Road, and this is where this building is located. The main sponsor of this event are going to be Naz 716 Studio, Fire 716, which is Frank Handley, and he'll be playing his music. His team will be there as well. He'll be doing DJ and the comedy and so many activities. Aero Transportation is one of the sponsors as well, and so is Highmark, Western New York. They'll be part of this as well. If you need more information, you can contact us at 716-531-2075. That's 716-531-2075, or you can email at info@naz716.com. We're looking forward to seeing you all here. Thank you so much for watching this, and we'll see you in a little while. Thank you.